Hi folks, it's 45 minutes on the recently published Greenhouse Gas Pathways method and an exploration of the published calculation tool as well. Thank you all very much for joining today. We've had some questions already in advance. I'll try and address those as we go along. We had some interesting, insightful questions this morning from attendees predominantly in Asia and Australasia, and I'll weave those into today's presentation, this afternoon's presentation as well. So, why are we doing this method? Well, this is about Criterion 5.3 under the Performance Standard, published version 3 in 2022, which calls for the use of an ASI-endorsed method for greenhouse gas pathways articulation, so those emissions reduction pathways to mid-century. And over the last couple of years, we've been working on the development of that method. Recently published, I'll talk about the timeline in a moment. And it's the use of that method in demonstrating conformance against Criterion 5.3 during ASI audits that's the important piece, and we'll talk about today what that means, how you use the method, how you provide evidence to auditors, and how you tailor the tool and the method to your specific supply chain activities within your certification scope, and actually even beyond your certification scope, because this method is one that can be used not just for ASI conformance, but can also be used outside of ASI to demonstrate 1.5 degree alignment. And that 1.5 degree alignment is important. That's what the tool had to do. 1.5 degree, including all direct and indirect emissions, and applicable to all ASI entities, no matter where they sit on the value chain. So all the way through from bauxite mining right the way through to the use of aluminium. What's been published? Well, in the last couple of weeks, we have released the English language version of the method, a written document, I hope quite concise, relatively, I hope, easy to comprehend, given that underlying this method is significant complexity, but we've tried to keep this as simple as possible for both entities and auditors. So English language has been published. You can find it on our website. Chinese language version is close to finalization. So you can expect to see in the coming days, maybe even by the end of this week, publication of the Chinese language version of the method. And if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to answer those, or you can get in touch with our Chinese team, Mr. Dong Chungming, Ms. Wen Zhang as well. In addition to the Word document or the written document, we have an Excel-based tool, Microsoft Excel-based calculation tool, again, English language, Chinese language coming in the coming weeks. And it's that tool that we'll explore a bit later on today. All those materials available on ASI's website, and Thad very kindly has added the links in the chat as well, so go and take a look there. In addition to the method itself and the calculation tool, we also have a whole module on greenhouse gas pathways articulation in the educational learning platform. So it's open to all to use. You do have to sign up. If you have any issues with sign up, please do get in touch with me or one of the ASI team. But it's a whole module containing a number of lessons. I recommend you take time to go through that. It's a lot of material in there, but that's in place to help you, entities and auditors, to understand the underlying science, also the method, and even down to the nuts and bolts of how you use the tool. So theory, method, and practice of ASI's greenhouse gas pathways method. So do take a look at that training material from ASI's learning team. In terms of the timeline, where are we now? Well, as I said before, we published the version 3 of the performance standard in mid-2022. And over the last few years, we've been exploring opportunities to use external methods, third-party methods, science-based targets, initiatives, etc., and to draw those into ASI for endorsement. Now, what we found was that they were either not 1.5 aligned, they didn't include all direct and indirect emissions, or they were not applicable to all entities along the value chain. We needed a method that wasn't just applicable to primary aluminium production or even to recycled aluminium production, but also applicable to downstream entities, including aluminium users, industrial users. So last year, we spent the year developing our own method, exploring different approaches, came up with one through the Climate Change Working Group and the Standards Committee that was recommended by the Standards Committee in September, endorsed by the board in November, and has now been published, as I mentioned before. Now, importantly, the next kind of waypost, the next gatepost here is the incorporation of the method into guidance. And so that will happen in the middle of this year. We update guidance relatively frequently, and that will happen in May 2024. And from that date, all audits that occur, ASI Performance Standard audits, will need to have demonstrated to the auditor by the entity that the method has been used to generate the pathway. So from 1st of June, date to be confirmed, once guidance is released, all audits from that date would need to use the ASI method in order to demonstrate their pathway. Question has come in about companies that are committed to science-based targets and the potential for dual slopes, a science-based targets initiative one with its own tool, I would say a complicated tool, and a second ASI one with a more simplified tool. Yes, that is true. That is true. But the science-based targets does not have applicable sectoral decarbonisation approach for aluminium, which is why we developed our own. So yes, there will be two. It is more work for member companies, absolutely. How aligned is the pathway method to the II pathways? Excellent question, Mission Possible. It is the same. So for primary aluminium, it draws on the IAI pathways and Mission Possible partnership and Centre for Climate Aligned Finance. For the downstream activities, it's all IAI data, their 1.5 degree pathway, which is broadly aligned with the net zero emissions scenario of International Energy Agency. So if you go into the tool and you can, the Excel tool, you actually see the IAI data in there and how our entity level slopes draw on the sector numbers in order to generate your sectoral slopes. So you can explore that, you can go and interrogate that data. We'll take a look on that later on. In fact, this is great timing for, to talk about this. This is the Mission Possible slope, right? This is exactly the sector data on which the entity level data is built. And what our method had to do was to take that sector slope and somehow allocate that to different entities all the way along the value chain. Now that I would say is relatively simple for primary aluminium because you have the bulk of emissions on primary and a known denominator, which is activity data output for smelter cast houses. But as you go along the value chain, those embodied emissions, and understand we're doing direct and indirect, so cradle to gate, all upstream emissions. As you move along the value chain, the denominator changes. You add a few more emissions on the numerator through casting processes, semi-fabrication processes, some recycling processes, fabrication processes, but they are very small compared to the primary number. So the numerator, as you move along the value chain, remains pretty constant in terms of sectoral absolute values, but the denominator changes significantly. 70 million tons of primary aluminium produced, 120 million tons of remelt, 100 million tons of semis output, around 70 million tons of fabricated output. So you see, as you move along the value chain, the denominator changes. So the intensity changes as you move along the value chain. And this is what our method had to do. It had to take account of those differences in intensity. And the approach that the working group took, the climate change working group, was to benchmark at set points along the value chain in order to measure entity level performance of intensity versus the sectoral slope. Those points were at the smelter cast house output, at cast houses with some kind of recycling input, and that was the input to that cast house, the input to semis, and the input to fabrication. And we'll explore some of those slopes in a moment, and what you as entities need to demonstrate using the tool at each of those points in the chain if you have those processes within your supply chain activities, within your certification scope. Let me just, before I go on, let me see if there's any other questions come in. Do we have to use this tool in the future if we install another process pathway to give an external platform, which costs a lot of money? It'd be a real pity when we can't use it anymore. For the ASI tool, you need one number, really, two numbers, sorry. Intensity of your processes in a baseline year and intensity of your procured metal in a baseline year. So the use of ASI's tool is relatively simple and cheap. I would be testing ASIs against your expensive model that's already out there if I were you. And if I can help with that, let me know. Right, let's get on. Applicability of different supply chain activities. You'll note in the report that for standalone bauxite mines and refineries, there are relatively few of those within ASI, I think a handful, maybe 5. There doesn't exist today sectoral slopes that can be used to plot entity level. So what we've said, the Standards Committee, is that at the moment, those entities don't need to use this method. Most of them, in fact, all of them aren't up for recertification soon anyway. We hope to have that model available by the end of this year. Having said that, the emissions that are embodied in bauxite and in alumina are included in the smelter value. So the smelter slope is a singular slope measured at the smelter cast house output, and it's a cradle to gate value. A single slope, cradle to gate, measured at the output of the smelter cast house. So one of the questions that's come in on the chat is about, this is product versus corporate, isn't it? Well, actually, no, it's the kind of hybrid. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But for the smelter, you're looking at the total emissions intensity across the whole portfolio of the certification scope measured at output. So in that sense, it's a product value. It's cradle to gate for 100% electrolytic measured at the output of the smelter cast house. There's an opportunity for you to choose to split your electricity and non-electricity related emissions to align with Centre for Climate Aligned Finance approaches. I'll talk about that when we get to the Excel spreadsheet. For other processes, it's a slightly different approach, and we'll talk about those one by one. Let's first of all explore this primary value and how it's been derived and the method behind that, because that's also applicable to later ones. I think I've showed this slide before. You may be familiar with it. This shows in the blue line the sector emissions intensity for primary aluminium production, cradle to gate, measured at the smelter cast house output, global average, under a 1.5 degree scenario. That is the Mission Possible Partnership IAI Centre for Climate Aligned Finance data. So that's the sectoral slope. It wasn't produced by ASI, it's been taken from IAI's work, which ultimately flows from the International Energy Agency's net zero emissions scenario. And in orange, you can see, at least in the baseline year, the spread of performance in the globe today, from sub 4 tons per ton for hydropowered smelters, highly efficient, using lowest carbon alumina, all the way up to more than 20 tons per ton for coal-fired smelters using higher intensity precursor materials. And what our method does is it says wherever you start in your base year, you have a defined entity-specific pathway that takes you towards convergence in 2050 on the sector average. So you can see here some example slopes of what smelters might have as their pathways moving forward. You can see for the lowest emitters today, relatively shallow to 2030, because they will have to decarbonize using novel technologies in anodes, carbon capture and storage, etc. That is not currently available. So their action is delayed to a given extent. Now, they do still have to reduce down in early years, but it's not as sharp as for the coal-fired and the fossil fuels, which are higher up. So that's the general method. It's a sectoral decarbonisation approach, which is intensity-based and seeks convergence on a global average under 1.5 by 2050. And this broadly is the approach that's applied at every single supply chain activity. Where that intensity is measured is slightly different. We'll talk about that as we proceed through today. But the approach is essentially the same, intensity convergence on the global average. What we can expect to see is that as the sectoral slopes change, because, for instance, action isn't taken early enough by entities, the slopes could well get steeper. Let's leave that for now, but that is a distinct possibility. One thing to note for primary, it's kind of important, especially for the higher emitters. 5.3, Criterion 5.3, demands the use of the method for pathway articulation. And you may well have a coal-fired smelter that defines its pathway from, let's say, 22 tonnes per tonne of aluminium down to, what's this, in 2030, something like 16 tonnes per tonne. That will be a 1.5 degree aligned pathway, the very top of this orange curve. So you could well be in conformance with 5.3, but you would not be conformant with 5.2. 5.2 has threshold values for smelting measured at the same place, cast house output of 13 tonnes per tonne by 2025 and 11 tonnes per tonne in 2030. You can see the 11 plotted here. It's essentially the global average. So 5.2 threshold values are more stringent than a 1.5 degree pathway. That's very important to note that 5.2 still applies. And even if you do have a pathway for fossil fueled aluminium that means conformance with 5.3, you still need to meet 5.2 in order to be certified. Right, so that's the primary, a singular slope measured cradle to gate at the output of the smelter cast house, so cold metal output from the cast house. Actually, it can include hot metal out of the cast house as well, but the output of your cast house. It only applies where the metal flowing through the system is 100% electrolytic. So if you have any recycled material in there, then you need to be using the next method, which is the cast house method, which is a separate cast house method that is applicable to cast houses which are taking in cold metal or recycled content. And for cast houses in this situation, as for semi-fabrication, there are two slopes described. So whereas for primary, it was one slope measured at the output of the cast house, here there are two slopes. And this is where the corporate product dichotomy starts to come in. We did explore the opportunity for a singular output number for cast houses, cradle to gate. But there we ran into issues around allocation of emissions in scrap. And what the outcome we've come to is that we do not take a position on your allocation approach for pre-consumer scrap in particular, or scraps in general. You may use a cutoff approach. You may use an avoided burden approach. It's up to you, the entity, which you choose. You need to use it consistently through the pathway in subsequent years, but it's up to you which one you choose. Now, in doing that, we were unable to have an output-based approach because then you had different approaches going on in the same value chain. So that's why when people ask why we got two slopes, it's actually a function of this fact that we needed to reconcile the fact that people were using different allocation approaches for scrap. That may change in the future, it may change, but for now, we are very flexible on the allocation approach. I do not want to get into a discussion on that today, so if you ask a question on that, I'm not answering it, but I'm happy to do it offline or in subsequent calls. What are those two slopes? Well, for both cast houses and for semi-fabrication, those slopes are one, a process slope. measured at the output of the process, and it's the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, corporate accounting, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions of that process, gate to gate. That's the first. Scope 1, Scope 2, related to that process. The second slope is a procurement slope. It's the intensity of the metal coming into the system. In that sense, it's a Scope 3 Category 1 number. That's a product value that has come into you with your corporate accounting approach. So it's the Scope 3 Category 1s of the input value, not the output. That's important to note. For cast houses, the input value and the output value is going to be, in terms of tonnage of material, is going to be kind of the same. Even in terms of intensity, it's going to be kind of the same because the denominator is pretty much the same. What goes into the cast house comes out of the cast house as a product. For semis, it's going to be different because, of course, your procured metal through the semis process produces output product, but it also produces scrap. So we're not measuring the output product intensity, we're measuring the intensity of the input, the slabs, the billet, averaged across the whole of the certification scope. Important to note for cast houses, it's the intensity of all input materials. So you need a weighted average between hot metal, cold metal, and scrap, with a yield value applied to the scrap because you're going to get some losses from the scrap input as well. So slight complexities there, but the important thing to note for those processes is procurement is measured at input, but the process, Scope 1 and 2, is measured at output. All of these values are intensity values. They're not absolute values, these are intensity values. Some examples for this, these are the process slopes using that same method as I showed you for primary, much lower emissions, a more kind of a less nuanced line, mainly because everyone's focused on the big emissions, not so much these emissions. You probably see some changes to this over time, I would imagine. And conformance would mean having performance that is aligned with both of those slopes. So reducing down process emissions and reducing procurement input related emissions as well. For fabrication, it's only one slope. It's a procurement slope. The reason for that is we don't have sector data on fabrication processes, which are very heterogeneous. That may change in the future again, we may incorporate, but for now it's just a procurement number. And we had a question this morning, which was from an industrial user saying, so does this mean that all consumers of aluminium, if they're certifying, need to be collecting and using their Scope 3 Category 1 data? And the answer is yes. Yes, you do. Industrial users or those engaged in fabrication will need to have a procurement slope in order to be conformant. I'm seeing loads and loads of questions coming in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and get through in the next 10 minutes or so the Excel sheet, and then I'll come back to those if that's okay. There's so many questions, and also I'm available in general to answer your questions too. A couple of things to note. One, that we're very flexible on the application or applicability of the pathways slope. We know that some entities, some corporates have multiple entities. We don't expect or don't demand that each entity has their own pathway. You can have one pathway across multiple entities. You can have one pathway that includes ASI entities and non-ASI entities. That's good for us. We want to drive change in ASI, but also outside ASI as well. You can split up your entities. You can have individual entity pathways. That's fine as well if you want to do that. You can even split up your corporate into ASI and non-ASI, have separate pathways for each, or even not have pathways for your non-ASIs. The one thing you can't do is to have pathways at the corporate level that miss out ASI entities. So every ASI entity must either have its own pathway or it must be part in its entirety, the whole of the certification scope, in a pathway that is bigger than the system. So lots of flexibility there in order to meet the fact that corporates have existing targets that are wider than just ASI entities. Final thing before we go to the Excel spreadsheet is base year choice, and the choice of base year impacts what you have to do in your first audit. If your first audit from the 1st of June this year, or the publication of the guidance, if that audit has a base year that is fewer than 3 years from the date of the audit, then in your first audit, all you need to do is demonstrate that you have defined the pathway using the tool and have a plan for achievement of that pathway. And it's only in subsequent audits, your recertification, that you would need to demonstrate performance. So for instance, 2025 audit using a 2023 baseline, you wouldn't be expected to demonstrate performance until 2028 or whenever your recertification audit comes round. If, however, your base year is more than 3 years prior to that first audit, you already have to demonstrate performance. So for instance, if you have a 2020 base year, your audit's in 2025, in that first audit, you already need to show not only the pathway, but also that you have achieved performance that is in line with that pathway as well. I had a question in advance about what about if I've been already version 3 certified in 2023? What do I do? Well, you don't have to do anything. You have your certificate, your certification. It's in the next audit, recertification audit, that you would be expected to use this tool and demonstrate it. So if you're 2023 audited and your next audit isn't until 2026, you do not need to articulate your pathway until 2026. Right, let's get down to it. How long have we got? I've got 15 minutes. Let's see if I can see any of those questions now before we get into that tool. So Hubertus, yeah, extrusion plant. I'll use you as an example in a moment when we get to the tool. So I'll do that. How can I make the tool operational? It doesn't draw a slope. Daniel, I know this is an issue for some companies. I'm working on that at the moment. If you have any technical issues, get in touch and I will help out. As my understanding, it's related to product GHG, as I think I've answered that already. What would be a recommendation to a smelter who has no visibility upstream mining and refining emissions to calculate cradle to gate footprint? Well, there's a couple of things in there, Julie, that can be used, and we talk about it in the method. One, IAI has published a Scope 3 tool and guidance. So for some emissions upstream, you can use proxy data, and that IAI proxy data or that guidance should be used. Having said that, the move should be towards getting hold of value chain emissions data. And chain of custody, on the one hand, gives you an opportunity to be able to do that, but increasingly through human rights due diligence and other value chain, supply chain mapping exercises, you should be getting hold of that data. And the move will be towards getting real value chain information. So I think in the early years, proxy data, at least for less material emissions, fine, but the move should be getting hold of that material and talking to your suppliers and leaning on them to get that data. The same with commodity traders. We'll talk about traceability another time. Maybe, Julie, it's a bigger subject than today. But indeed, this visibility along the supply chain is critical if you're going to meet these requirements. Anonymous attendees are asked about for the primary, the cast house outputs. If you remelt your own scrap, for example, butts from ingots, you'd use the 100% electrolytic. So there, I don't count internal scrap as remelt. If you're doing your own scrap remelt in the system and you're not pulling that in from outside, it's 100% electrolytic going around and around. It will impact your cast house emissions. They will go up. So cradle to gate at the output, already the emissions associated with the remelt of your own scrap will be included. So if you are a smelter cast house remelting your own scrap, use the 100% electrolytic tab. That's the yellow one that I'll talk about in a moment. Where can we get these proxy data? International Aluminium Institute website. The link is in our methods. So please take a look at the method published. The database used for the tool is corporate data. You can find it within the tool. There's some hidden tabs. In fact, let's explore that now. Let's go and do that now. Bear with me. It's always difficult to go through an Excel spreadsheet while on a webinar when you have 12 boxes open at the same time. In fact, I'm going to minimize the Q&A for a moment. So sorry if I don't answer your questions in real time. This is the tool. It's Microsoft Excel based. It has relatively few user inputs in order to generate your slopes. One of the kind of underlying priorities was that this was simple to use for entities and auditors. And you can see here at the beginning, we've color-coded boxes. So the yellow boxes are ones where user data is required, where it's relevant. And there are some options for optional user data entry. I'll talk about when that is in a moment. Lots of auto calculation going on, the gray boxes. And the orange fields are the slope data themselves. Now that is, you can copy and paste that. You can take that slope data and generate your own charts, but the tool also generates charts for you. So I'll talk a bit about that in the remaining 10 minutes. One thing to note, the tool is locked. Sheets are locked and password protected, and that's to stop fat-fingered changes to formulae. But I do share the password here. We've given you the password. So if you want to interrogate the data, if you want to unhide tabs, if you want to see what data has been used, sector data, in order to generate the entity slopes, fill your boots. Go and explore and let me know if we've got it wrong. So I do want you to explore this, but we've locked it down just so that users aren't changing formulae by mistake. The one thing that everyone has to do, all entities, you will have to choose a baseline year following those baseline year rules that I spoke about earlier and which are written down here. The earliest year you can choose is 2016, very earliest, and the latest year you can choose is the prior year, so full year. So 2023 is the last year that you can choose a baseline year for. And when you choose this year, it cascades to the rest of the workbook. So you only have to do this once. Once you've done it, you've done it. And then the rest of the book takes its data. So I'm going to use 2020 as a baseline year, probably an awful baseline year considering COVID. So probably I'd recommend people don't use that, but maybe you will. So 2020 is the choice. If you are a primary smelter, so if you're a smelter who is doing 100% electrolytic or just recycling your own scrap, it's this yellow tab that you'll be using. All other supply chain activities will use the blue tab. They're the only places for user data entry. So no other tab has user data entry. It's all background data. So there's only these two places that you need to enter data. And you can see, as I toggle between them, these yellow data entry fields, relatively few of those. So there's not a lot of data required in order to generate slopes. Let's do primary first. Let's look at the smelters. As I mentioned before, you can have multiple smelters within your pathway, and so here there's some automated averaging, production weighted averaging if you have multiple smelters. So I'm going to have two smelter cast houses, one with a production of 1,000 tons, they're very small smelters, and one with a production of 500 tons. And the one piece of data you need for each is the intensity cradle to gate of output. So I'm going to give this one a relatively high emissions number, 17.2. And this next one is going to be much lower. It's going to be 6.3, cradle to gate. And as I press return here, you'll see that the production weighted average of 13.6 is plotted on this right-hand curve. We've also put in those threshold values of 5.2 for those who are interested. And the dashed line is the sector average. So this green solid line is your entity pathway. You can see for 2020, that's the 13.6 weighted average. The prior years are also plotted on there just for your information and use, particularly if you use early year baselines. But you can also split out your electricity related emissions. So for this 17.2, you could have, let's say it's going to be something like 16 as your electricity related. You can see this doesn't split it because you've got two smelters here. You have to have a second value down here. What that does is that enables this split electricity, non-electricity on this left-hand chart. So here you could use either a combined slope or a split slope electricity, non-electricity, measured at the output. I think that's relatively simple for primary. Probably of more interest to those online today are the downstream processes. You remember before, casting and semis, you need a process number and a procurement number. Fabrication, you only need a procurement number. And in this system, if you have combined processes, you can also have an integrated procurement slope. So a question came in, what if I have casting and rolling, do I have to have 4 slopes or what? Well, you can have 4 slopes, 2 process, 2 procurement, or you can have 3 slopes, 2 process and 1 integrated procurement. In order to do that, you have to have your massive input data here in column C, because you have to mass weight it. And also you have to note that if you have rolling, the emissions associated with the input material that flows through your cast house has already been taken account of by the cast house. So the intensity that you're looking for under semis is actually the intensity of slabs that you're purchasing from elsewhere. That's explained in more detail in the method, but is important because otherwise you're double counting. So if you have an integrated or you want to use an integrated slope, take a look at the method, and I'm happy to talk you through that as well. Let's have some examples in here. For process, for casting, let's say it's 0.5. Already you can see the slope data is generated, and actually the slope is also put on in chart format as well. So let's say your intensity coming into the system is 10. That then generates your procurement slope for casting. For the next, let's do for semis, let's say that's 0.43, and you've got a kind of much higher one here. You've got 19 tons per ton. You can see there you've got 4 slopes generated. But if I put in the procurement tonnages, let's say 1,000 tons of cold metal coming into the cast house and 500 tons of slab coming in, that then generates an integrated slope at the bottom down here. And you could use that integrated procurement slope instead. That's a very whistle-stop tour, but what I would say is that all of these data are then plotted in subsequent charts. Fabrication, as I mentioned before, you only need a procurement. So this is important. If you're an industrial user or a downstream user, I think this question came in. Let's say you're an automotive parts producer, your stamping sheet. You need to put in the input intensity of that sheet, 10.3, that you would get from your supplier. You actually don't even need to get in your mass because you don't have an integrated slope. But already with that one number, your intensity, your procurement slope is plotted. So actually it's quite close to the global average. That's it in a nutshell. A very quick run through of that, but is to say that I think in 8 minutes, we've generated slopes for all of those different processes using relatively few pieces of data. The important thing to understand is where is that measured? Smelting or primary is measured at cast house output. Semis and casting, process measured at output. Procurement measured at input. Fabrication measured at input. Procurement of aluminium metal and associated intensities. Right, let's see in the last few minutes if we can get through some more questions. And I'm sorry about the speed of today. 45 minutes is not enough. Do take a look at the training materials and do get in touch if you have any questions. Right, let's go. For emissions intensity for the smelter, are you considering cast house production or hot metal production? Cast house production, cast house production. So the output of cast houses. Now, some cast houses produce hot metal, so you would include that there as well. But it's the output of the cast house. So if you're producing P1020, it's the P1020. If you're producing a portfolio of P1020 billets and slab, it's the average across all of that product portfolio. Thank you, Eman. For primary, is the cast house output suitable if you, sorry, that question's already been done, as has that. Where can I get the proxy data? Already answered that question. What's the database used? It's the IAI data. You can interrogate that yourself. For corporate GHGs, which assessment report do we need to follow? Follow the greenhouse gas protocol. Greenhouse gas protocol. Greenhouse gas protocol. And for the latest, for primary, I would point you to the IAI's carbon footprint guidance, because that draws on the GHG protocol. So if you're a primary smelter, really we follow the carbon footprinting guidance of IAI, the International Aluminium Institute. How to get the cradle to gate emissions intensity? You mean for as a smelter, you have to ask your suppliers. You've got to start asking your suppliers for emissions data. Full stop. Production we have to enter in the primary is in the Malta. It's cold metal, Nadia. It's cold metal output from the cast house, or the output of the cast house, not hot metal into the cast house, output from the cast house. Unless you're remelting, in which case someone else's scrap, in which case you use the input hot metal in the cast house tab. That's important. Read the report. That's actually in there as well. Recycling using scrap does very little primary. You need to use the cast house tab, right? That's correct, Winfried. And your slope will look, let's do it in real time, Winfried. So if this is a recycler using scrap drosses, very little primary. Let's have a look at what they might look like. So there is cast house tab. Your process scope intensity is probably going to be on the higher end, because you're bringing in cold metal and scrap. So you can, let's say it's 0.454 for your scope 1s and 2s. But your input materials, dross, scrap, non-primary, your procurement is going to be very low. It's going to be, let's say, 0.4, something like that. You can see that, and let me show you what that looks like plotted. Your slope for process 1 and 2 higher than the global average. This is what that would look like. Actually, that's where you're going to have to put in most of your efforts on the process reduction. But your procurement from cast house, it looks like this. You can see the global average includes all of that global primary, but your slope as a recycler cast house is going to look like that bottom one. You are going to have to take some action, but really you're near zero already. So the procurement slope for you guys is already, it looks already good. Now, what does this say? It says if you're a cast house that's using more primary, you're going to have more of a slope. So you're going to want to use more low carbon primary input or more scrap input. I mean, that's the point. That's the point. The only way that the downstream can achieve these slopes is if primary reduces and we get back as much scrap as possible with as high quality as possible. And even then, we're still going to need a load of primary. So without primary reducing, actually conformance is going to be quite difficult. I have a couple of questions. Jean-Marc, I'm afraid they're both your questions. They're very technical and I've run out of time. So if you don't mind, I will get in touch with you after this webinar to discuss those. Final thing to say, I'm available to talk through some of this material one-to-one or in group sessions, and we will have an introduction to this in more detail at a workshop at the World Aluminium Conference, the CRU conference in London in May. I think we have at least half a day, probably a whole day to go through this material, but I'm also available online and by phone should you need me. With that, thank you all very much. Look forward to hearing from you offline. I'm sure I will. Yeah, see you at the next webinar